What if I told you that the enemy, the very same enemy that destroyed this ship, preserved it better than its own country? That the Japanese emperor awarded the Russian commander an order for a battle in which he fired upon Japanese ships? What if I told you that this cruiser did not perish in battle, nor from a torpedo, nor from a shell, but was betrayed by allies and sold for scrap? Today, I will tell you a story that wasn't printed in the newspapers, because it shatters the familiar narrative. It asks questions to which there are no easy answers. Meet the cruiser Varyag, the most famous Russian cruiser. You think you know this story? You don't even know the half of it. 3 lives under 3 flags, 2 oceans, 1 war that it lost, and a whole world that loved it for it, including its enemies. Stay until the end, because the most incredible part begins not when the ship goes to the bottom, but when it rises from it. The Korean port of Chemulpo, February 9th, 1904. Early morning. Fog lies on the water like a thick blanket. It smells of salt, seaweed, and coal smoke. Somewhere on the shore, a bird cries. It is quiet. Ships of 6 nations stand in the roadstead. British, French, Italian, and American vessels rock on the gentle swell. An ordinary morning in a neutral port. But on 2 ships flying the St. Andrew's flag, no one is sleeping. On the cruiser Varyag and the gunboat Koretz, the crews are already at their stations. Steam is up in the boilers. The guns are uncovered. The men are silent. There is nothing to talk about. Everything was already said during the night. The commander of the Varyag, captain of the first-rank Vsevolod Rudnev, stands on the bridge. He is 47 years old. He is a professional naval officer. He knows what war is. And he knows the math. 2 ships against 14. Beyond the fog, at the exit from the port, this squadron is already waiting. 6 cruisers, 8 torpedo boats. Japanese Admiral Sotokichi Uryu had lined them up across the channel at dawn. He is in no hurry. The Russians have nowhere to go. The ultimatum was delivered the day before. The terms were simple. Leave the port by noon or be attacked right at anchor. Uryu was polite, even courteous. But behind the courtesy stood 6-inch guns. Rudnev received the ultimatum, read it, gathered his officers. There were options. They could stay. International law forbade attacking in neutral waters. They could surrender, without a fight, without blood, saving their lives. The Japanese were ready to accept an honorable capitulation. Rudnev listened to it all, and gave the order, raise steam. Notes flew to the shore to the commanders of the foreign vessels. Short, businesslike. He asked them to take the wounded and sick on board, just in case. Foreign officers stepped out onto the decks of their ships. They watched as the men lined up on the Varyag, as the sounds of the ship's orchestra drifted across the water, as the anchor chains slowly crawled upward. British Captain Bailey would later write in his report that he took off his cap. He just took it off and held it in his hand, not knowing why himself. The Varyag moved toward the harbor exit. Ahead, in the fog, the silhouettes of Japanese cruisers could be made out. This ship had been built 5 years earlier in America. She was beautiful. 129 meters of steel elegance, 12 guns, snow-white superstructures, the pride of the fleet. She was called one of the best cruisers in the Russian Navy. But inside this beauty, a death sentence had been quietly dying for several years. A sentence known to the engineers, known to the officers, known in the Ministry of the Navy, and which no one had time, or desire, to fix in time. It was this hidden flaw that predestined the outcome of the battle even before the first shot was fired. Philadelphia, 1898. The William Cramp & Sons shipyard. They build the best ships in the world here. Or, at least, that's what the Americans themselves believe. Huge slipways, thousands of workers, the smell of hot metal and machine oil. Clients with money and ambitions come here from all over the world. This year, the Russians arrived with money and ambitions. To understand why the Russian Empire ordered warships in America, you need to look at a map. Just take a world map from the late 19th century and find Russia, a massive country, the largest on Earth. It stretches from the Baltic to the Pacific Ocean. And here is the problem. It has access to the sea, but no proper military fleet in the east. The Baltic fleet is far away. The Black Sea fleet is locked in by straits. And in the Far East, where Russia had just leased the ice-free Port Arthur from China, ships are needed. Urgently. Their own shipyards are not enough. Building takes a long time. And right next to Port Arthur, something alarming is already happening. Japan is building a fleet. Quickly, methodically, with German precision and British help. Japanese officers study in England. Japanese shipyards work in 3 shifts. Tokyo looks at Manchuria and Korea and sees Russians there. No one in the Japanese government likes this. St. Petersburg understands this and hurries. Orders for ships fly to Germany, France, Denmark, and to America. William Cramp and Sons gets the contract to build a first-rank protected cruiser. Displacement, 6,000 tons. 12 main-caliber guns. And most importantly, speed, 23.5 knots. For comparison, this is faster than most Japanese cruisers of that time. The ship was supposed to run away from what it needed to run away from, and catch up with what it needed to catch up with. On October 31st, 1899, the cruiser was launched. They named her Varyag. The name was not chosen by chance. Varangians, Varyags, was what the Rus called people from Scandinavia. The very Normans who came from the north on painted longships and brought with them statehood and a warrior spirit. The first professional warriors, men who did not know the word retreat. A beautiful name for a beautiful ship. And the ship truly was beautiful. 129 meters long, snow-white superstructures, 2 funnels, an elegant, almost predatory silhouette. Journalists present at the launch wrote that it was a work of art made of steel. The Russian officers receiving the ship were satisfied. Almost. Because even then, during sea trials, engineers noticed something unpleasant. The boilers. The Nicholas boiler system. Here we need to stop for a minute. Nicholas boilers were a French design, theoretically advanced. They were supposed to be lightweight, build up steam quickly, and provide high power. On paper, excellent. In practice, a disaster. The design was temperamental. The boiler tubes leaked. Pressure was unstable. They were difficult to maintain and even harder to repair. Experienced mechanics could squeeze the required performance out of them, but only in ideal conditions, in the open air, with a full set of spare parts. On trials, the Varyag showed 23.2 knots. The contract was fulfilled. The money was paid. The ship was accepted. But several engineers carefully wrote in their reports, the boilers require special attention. Their lifespan is limited. Regular, qualified maintenance is necessary. These reports were read, filed away, and successfully forgotten. In 1901, the Varyag entered service and headed for the Far East, to her permanent base in Port Arthur. 2 years of service passed. Intensive service. Cruises, maneuvers, exercises. The Nicholas boilers worked, but every month, a little worse. The repair base in Port Arthur was not designed for such technology. There was a shortage of spare parts, and a shortage of specialists. By 1904, the Varyag could reach a maximum of 14 knots. 14, instead of 23. These are not just numbers. This meant the ship could not escape the Japanese cruisers. It could not catch them. It could only shoot, and take fire in return. A beauty with a rotten heart. This was exactly how the Varyag arrived in Chemulpo in January 1904, on a diplomatic mission to a neutral port into a quiet Korean harbor, right where a trap was already waiting for her. Imagine a chessboard the size of half of Asia. On it stand the pieces: Russian, Japanese, Chinese, British, American. Every player is reaching for the same corner of the board, for warm water ports, for trade routes, for Manchuria and Korea. The late 19th century is an era when the great powers divided the world with the methodical nature of accountants. Britain took India. France took Indochina. Germany took pieces of Africa. Russia moved east and bumped into Japan. By this time, Japan was a completely different country, not the closed island empire that American guns had forced open half a century earlier. The Japanese knew how to learn. They took their army from the Germans, their navy from the British, their jurisprudence from the French. And from this, they assembled something new and very dangerous. By 1904, the Japanese fleet was one of the strongest in the world. Not on paper, on the water. New battleships, fast cruisers, trained crews. Japanese admirals studied Trafalgar and Tsushima as closely as Europeans studied Napoleon. And they looked at the Russians without fear. Russia, in turn, looked at the Far East as a prize. In 1898, it leased Port Arthur from China, an ice-free port on the Yellow Sea. This was what Russian strategists dreamed of: access to a warm sea in the east, plus a railway across Manchuria, plus concessions, plus troops. Tokyo saw this and considered it a direct threat. Negotiations were ongoing between the two countries. Long, sticky, nowhere-leading negotiations. The Russian side stalled for time. Their fleet wasn't ready yet. The Japanese side stalled for time. Their fleet was already ready. The difference between these two, stalling for time, cost thousands of lives. In this game, Korea was a buffer, and simultaneously the prize. Formerly an independent kingdom, practically a battlefield of foreign interests. The Japanese had already built railways there. They already kept troops there. They already looked at Seoul as their city. And Chemulpo was located right in Korea, a port 30 miles from Seoul. Large, convenient, international. Merchant ships from all over the world unloaded here. Warships of 6 nations stood in the roadstead, each guarding its own merchants and diplomats. Neutral territory, a place where war does not happen. It was here, in January 1904, that the Varyag was sent on a diplomatic mission, to maintain a presence, to guard the consulate, to show the flag. A routine assignment. But while the Varyag stood in the roadstead and her officers paid visits to their foreign colleagues, the Japanese general staff had already made a decision. The date was set. The plans were approved. All that was left was to execute. Japanese Admiral Uryu received orders to take Chemulpo under control, to secure the landing of troops, to neutralize the Russian ships. The word neutralize always sounds neat in military documents. Something much less neat hides behind it. Uryu was an experienced officer. He understood the delicacy of the situation. A neutral port, foreign ships, international law. Attacking the Varyag right in the roadstead meant a scandal, possibly a war with several nations at once. So he chose another way. He positioned his squadron at the harbor exit, 14 ships across the channel, and he sent Rudnev a polite note. Leave the port by noon on February 9th. You're probably thinking, this is a trap, an obvious trap. If you stay, they attack you right in the harbor. If you leave, they attack you on the open water. Yes, it was a trap. And Uryu had planned it in advance, days before he handed over the note. Because by that moment, the war had already begun. On the night of February 8th, while Chemulpo slept, Japanese torpedo boats entered the harbor of Port Arthur. Torpedoes were already speeding toward the hulls of Russian battleships. The Russo-Japanese War had begun, without a declaration, without a warning, in the dark. The Varyag did not know this. Rudnev received Uryu's note in the morning. He didn't know yet that Port Arthur was already burning, that the war was already underway, that the first Russian sailors were already dead. He knew only one thing. The Japanese squadron was standing at the exit, waiting. The night of February 8th to 9th in the commander's cabin on the Varyag was a long one. The commander's cabin on the Varyag was small. A desk, maps, a lamp swinging from the ceiling in time with the gentle swell. Outside the porthole, the blackness of a February night and the lights of the Japanese ships in the roadstead. Rudenev read the note for the third time. Japanese Admiral Uryu wrote politely, almost cordially. He announced that hostilities had begun between Japan and Russia. He invited the Varyag and the Koreans to leave the port by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a deadline later shortened to noon. Otherwise, they would be attacked right in the roadstead, in neutral waters, in the presence of ships from 6 nations. Rudenev put the paper down, looked at the map. He was an experienced officer, 20 years of service. He knew how to calculate, and he was calculating now, methodically, without panic, the way men calculate when they have long accepted that war is, first and foremost, mathematics. 14 Japanese ships against 2 Russian ones. 6 cruisers, Asama, Naniwa, Takachiho, Nitaka, Akashi, Chiyoda. 8 torpedo boats. The total broadside of the Japanese squadron exceeded the Russian one by 8, by some estimates, 10 times. Asama, Uryu's flagship, was an armored cruiser. Thick armor, 8 main-caliber guns. The Varyag had practically nothing that could pierce her. Rudenev knew this. He also knew something else. His own ship would yield a maximum of 14 knots. Asama could do 18. Escape was impossible. Breaking through was only possible if the Japanese made a mistake. And the Japanese did not make mistakes. He summoned his officers. The wardroom of the Varyag. Midnight. Around the table, Executive Officer Stepanov, lieutenants, midshipmen, young faces. Some are not even 25. They listen to the commander and try not to look each other in the eye. Rudenev laid out the situation briefly, without embellishments. There were 3 options. First, stay in the roadstead. Cite the neutrality of the port. Wait for the diplomats to sort it out. International law is on our side. Silence fell in the cabin. Everyone understood. The Japanese had already attacked Port Arthur in the night. They had already violated international law. Twice. Uryu's note was written after the torpedoes had struck the hulls of the Russian battleships. Waiting for diplomats meant waiting to be arrested right at the pier. Second option, surrender. Strike the colors, save lives. The Japanese guaranteed an honorable capitulation. No one at the table said it out loud, but everyone was thinking it. 630 men on board. Living people. Everyone has a mother. Many have wives, children. One of the young lieutenants, years later he would write about it in his memoirs, looked at the flame of the lamp and thought of one thing. His fiancée was waiting for him in Kronstadt. The wedding was set for autumn. Rudenev looked around the table. We will not lower the flag. Not a question. A statement. Quiet, almost matter of fact. Third option. Go out. Accept battle. Try to break through to Port Arthur, or, if a breakthrough is impossible, inflict maximum damage and return. Scuttle the ships. Do not strike the flag. The officers did not stay silent for long. Executive Officer Stepanov nodded first, then the rest. This was not recklessness. Understand this correctly. It was the cold calculation of men who understood that some things are more important than survival. If the Varyag surrendered without a fight, it wasn't just a disgrace for the crew. It would send a signal to the entire Far East. Russia is broken even before the war begins. It would be a blow to Port Arthur, to Vladivostok, to the empire's entire Far Eastern policy. Rudenev was not suicidal. He was an officer who understood the value of symbols. After the council, he wrote a report to the commanders of the foreign ships. He briefly informed them, the Varyag and Koreans are going out to meet the Japanese squadron. He requests them to take the wounded and sick on board, in advance. British Captain Bailey read this note twice. Then he stared out the porthole for a long time. No one slept on the Varyag that night. Gunners checked the artillery. Mechanics looked at the boilers one last time. Maybe they could squeeze out a little more. Orderlies prepared a dressing station in the forward compartment. The ship's priest, Father Mikhail, held a service. Right on the deck, by the light of lanterns. The crew stood in silence, 630 men in the dark, with only the priest's voice, the splashing of water against the hull, and the distant lights of the Japanese ships. One sailor, very young, a new recruit, approached the boatswain after the service. "Will we come back?" The boatswain was a man of few words and honesty. "Do your job," he said. "The rest is not our concern." Dawn broke, gray and cold. At 11:20 a.m., the bells were struck on the Varyag. The anchor chains began to rise. On the foreign ships, they noticed the movement and started coming out onto the decks. The French cruiser Pascal, the British Talbot, the Italian Elba, the American gunboat Vicksburg. Officers removed their caps. Sailors stood at attention. A Frenchman shouted something. The wind carried the words away, but the intonation was understood without translation. On the Varyag, the orchestra began to play. They were sailing to their deaths, and the orchestra was playing. It seems impossible. It seems made up. But that is exactly how it was. The commanders of the foreign ships would later write reports to their governments. They would use different words, French, English, Italian. But the meaning of all of them would be the same. What we saw this morning, it was something you don't talk about right away. It takes time to process. The Varyag was leaving the harbor. Ahead in the morning fog, the silhouettes of the Japanese cruisers were already emerging, and in a few minutes, the guns would roar. 11:45 a.m. The Japanese squadron opened fire first. Osama fired from a distance of about 45 cables, less than 9 kilometers. For early 20th century naval artillery, a standard working distance. The first shell fell short. A column of water rose off the starboard beam. General quarters was sounded on the Varyag. Although the alarm had already been sounded, it's just that now it became real. Rudnev ordered return fire. The first minutes of a battle are always chaos. You have to understand this before reading official reports with their calm columns of numbers. Behind those numbers is a roar that makes your ears bleed, smoke that blinds you beyond 20 meters, a deck that shudders underfoot with every salvo, and people, living people doing their jobs in this hell. Gunner Dmitry Lukin, he was 22 years old, stood at gun number 3 and loaded without thinking about anything. His hands did what they had been trained to do for 2 years. Left hand, take the shell. Right hand, feed it. Close the breech, step back, fire. Japanese shells began to find their mark in the 5th minute of the battle. The first hit struck the bow section. The explosion tore up the deck and instantly wiped out the entire crew of gun number 1, 5 men. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone. They were just standing there, and then nothing. Rudnev held his course. The Varyag sailed under the fire of 6 Japanese cruisers. Uryu had positioned his squadron skillfully. The Russian ship was caught in a crossfire. Whichever way Rudnev turned, shells flew from 2 sides simultaneously. In the 14th minute, a shell exploded on the bridge. Shrapnel struck Rudnev in the head. It didn't penetrate, it grazed him, but the force was enough. The commander dropped to one knee. Blood poured over his temple, cheek, collar. His adjutant rushed to him. Rudnev raised his hand. "Stay back." He stood up, wiped the blood with his sleeve, and continued to command. This moment, remember it. Not because it sounds beautiful, but because exactly at this moment, dozens of men on the bridge and on the deck saw their commander, with blood on his face, standing right under the shells, and continued to do their jobs. The fear didn't go anywhere, but the commander stood, and so they stood. This is what true command is. The shells continued to explode. A hit to the stern, the crew of gun number 8 destroyed. A hit to the engine room, 3 mechanics wounded. A fire on the middle deck, the crew fights the flames under continuous bombardment. Pipelines are severed. Water floods the lower compartments. Orderlies drag the wounded to the forward dressing station. The ship's doctor, Banshikov, worked non-stop. Later, in his report, he would write dryly, "During the battle, assistance was rendered to several dozen men." Behind this dry phrase, severed limbs, burns, shrapnel wounds, and the hands of a doctor that did not tremble. And now, stop. Because here, official history and reality diverge, and this is important. Russian post-battle reports claimed a destroyed Japanese cruiser and several sunken torpedo boats. Rudnev insisted. The Varyag's fire was accurate. Japanese losses were significant. Japanese archives say otherwise. According to Japanese documents, declassified much later, the losses of the Japanese squadron in the Battle of Chemulpo amounted to a few men killed and a few wounded. Not a single ship was seriously damaged. How to explain this? Several factors. Gun smoke in the confined space of the bay blocked visibility. The gunners were firing almost blind. Long distances. Constant maneuvering under fire, which threw off their aim. And 14 knots instead of 23. The Varyag could not take an advantageous position. It was only running from shells. This is the uncomfortable truth about the Battle of Chemulpo. But here's what is strange. This truth changes absolutely nothing about the assessment of the feat. Nothing at all. Because the feat was not in the accuracy of the gunfire. Rudnev drove the ship forward, under the fire of 6 cruisers, with a wounded head, with dying men on the deck, with boilers giving half their design power. He knew from the very beginning a breakthrough was impossible. And yet he pressed on. 35 minutes in the battle, it became definitively clear there would be no breakthrough. The steering gear was damaged. The list was increasing. Human casualties, over 30 killed, over 120 wounded, almost 1 in 5 of the crew. Rudnev made the decision to return to Chemulpo. The Japanese cruisers did not pursue. Ariu remembered the neutral waters and the foreign ships in the harbor. He waited. The Varyag entered the port slowly, down by the bow, with fires on the deck. On the foreign ships, men came out to the rails again. But this time they were silent in a different way. Not ceremonially, quietly. The battle lasted 48 minutes. The flag on the Varyag had not been raised in surrender, nor had it been struck. Rudnev entered his cabin, sat at the desk, and began to write his report. His hand did not tremble. The blood on his temple had already dried. Outside the porthole, the Japanese squadron was still waiting. And then Rudnev made the second decision of the day, perhaps the hardest one. Rudnev's second decision was as simple and irreversible as his first. The ship must not fall into enemy hands. This was not an order from above. It was the decision of a commander who looked at his battered cruiser and realized, the Varyag is no longer a fighter. The steering is broken. The list is growing. There are holes below the waterline. The boilers are barely breathing. The Japanese squadron waits at the port exit. If the Varyag stays afloat, Uryu will enter the harbor and take her, with all the guns, all the documentation, the ciphers, and the maps. A living trophy. That will not happen. Rudnev gathered his officers for the second time that day. He explained briefly. The crew is to evacuate to the foreign vessels. Wounded first. We scuttle the ship. One of the midshipmen asked quietly, and the Koreets? Gunboat Commander Belyev had made the same decision independently. The Koreets would be blown up. She didn't have seacocks for rapid flooding. The explosion was scheduled for 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The evacuation began. The foreign ships sent lifeboats. The French, the British, the Italians, the Americans. Everyone. Without hesitation, without talk of neutrality. Lifeboats went to the side of the Varyag, one after another. The wounded were carried on stretchers. Some were unconscious. Some were conscious and begged to be put on their feet. They didn't want to leave lying down. Dr. Banchchikov left last among the medical staff, checking every compartment, making sure no one was left behind. The sailors left the ship in silence. Some looked back. One, the very young one who had asked the bosun that night, stopped on the gangway and put his hand on the railing. He stood there for a second. The bosun touched his shoulder. Go! Down in the engine room, mechanics were opening the seacocks. It is not fast and not pretty. Opening seacocks means manually turning the valves through which water will flood into the hull. Heavy work. Quiet work. Water began entering the bilges at 1:10 p.m. Rudnev was the last to leave. He walked the ship, alone, without his adjutant, without an escort. He walked across the deck, past the shattered guns, past the pools of blood they hadn't had time to wash away, past the place where, hours ago, the crew of the first gun had stood. What he thought in those minutes, no one knows. He didn't write about it in his report or his memoirs. Some things people do not write down. He stepped into the boat. The boat pushed off from the side. At 1:50 p.m., the Varyag rolled onto her port side and slowly slipped underwater. The depth in that spot was shallow, about 10 meters. The masts remained sticking out above the water. At 1:55 p.m., the Korets exploded. The blast was heard across the entire port. A column of smoke rose high above the harbor. On the foreign ships, people stood in silence. And now, the very question that historians have been asking for over 100 years. What did the Varyag actually achieve in this battle? If you look at the numbers honestly, not much. The Japanese squadron didn't lose a single ship. Uryu's casualties were minimal. The Varyag didn't break through to Port Arthur. Strategic result? 0. Some historians stop right there. They say, myth, propaganda, exaggerated reports. Rudnev exaggerated Japanese losses to justify his own defeat. Perhaps. Officers did that. It's human. But there is one fact these historians bypass. Uryu waited outside. The whole battle, he waited. His 14 ships stood at the exit and did not enter the harbor, neither during the battle nor immediately after. The Japanese admiral didn't dare attack the neutral port until the Russians themselves decided their fate. This means one thing. The Varyag, by sailing out and giving battle, bought time for the crew's evacuation. Over 600 men left the ship, not into captivity, but onto neutral vessels, alive, because the commander went out and accepted the battle. And one more fact, one that isn't usually mentioned in the context of defeats. The flag on the Varyag was never lowered. Not once. Not during the battle, not during the scuttling. The Japanese entered Chemulpo and saw the mass of the sunken cruiser, without a white flag. Uryu wrote in his report, "The Russian sailors fought with honor." This was written by the man who had just destroyed them. The crews of the Varyag and Korets were taken on neutral ships to various ports, then back to their homeland. In St. Petersburg, they were met like heroes. The emperor received them personally. Every crew member received the Cross of St. George. Rudnev received the rank of Fleetal Adjutant and a golden weapon. The ship lay on the bottom of Chemulpo. Its masts poked above the water. It seemed the story was over, but the Varyag had one more life left, and it was started by the enemy. The war ended in September 1905. Russia lost. It was the first time in modern history that a European power had lost a war to an Asian country. The world was shocked. St. Petersburg was shocked. Tokyo celebrated. In this war, the Japanese fleet did what seemed impossible. It destroyed 2 Russian squadrons. First, the Pacific one, then the Baltic one, which had sailed halfway around the world, only to be annihilated in a few hours at Tsushima. Admiral Togo became a national hero. Japanese naval might was proven. And in this atmosphere of victory, in August 1905, Japanese divers descended into the murky waters of Chemulpo and began the work of raising the Varyag. Why would the victor raise another ship? The practical answer? A trophy. Metal, guns, mechanisms. 6,000 tons of useful iron that could be repaired and used. After a major war, the Japanese fleet needed replenishment and resources. But there was another answer, less practical and more important. Japanese military culture of that time was built on a concept that is difficult to translate in one word. It is respect for a worthy opponent. Not pity, not condescension, exactly respect. As an equal who fought as a warrior should fight. For Japanese officers, the Varyag was not just a trophy. It was a symbol, proof that their victory was real, because they had defeated men who refused to surrender. Victory over a coward is worth nothing. Victory over a brave man is worth everything. The salvage operation took several months. The divers worked in difficult conditions. Visibility was near zero, the hull was mangled, Some of the equipment was destroyed. Japanese engineers would later say the ship held together better than they expected, even on the bottom. On August 8, 1905, the Varyag was raised. The Japanese inspected the ship carefully. The damage was severe, but not critical. The Niklaus boilers, naturally, required total replacement. Japanese engineers installed different, more reliable ones. They overhauled the guns, patched the hull. The repairs took almost 2 years. On July 9, 1907, the repaired ship was ceremoniously commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. She was given a new name, Soya. And here is where something happened that still makes historians stop and reread the documents. By personal order of Emperor Mutsuhito, an inscription was left on the ship's stern. Varyag, the old one, Russian, with the hard sign at the end, the way it was spelled before the orthography reform. The new Japanese ship carried 2 names. The official one, Soya, and the real one, the one stamped on the stern, which every Japanese sailor who stepped on her deck knew. Think about that for a second. The victor took a trophy, repaired it, included it in his fleet, and left the name of the vanquished on the stern. Not because they forgot to rename it. Not because they didn't have time. By personal order of the emperor. Why? The answer lies in how the Soya was used. The ship did not become a combat unit. She became a training vessel. It was precisely on the Soya that Japanese naval academies sent their cadets, the future officers of the fleet, and their training program included the following. Every cadet who boarded the Soya had to know the history of this ship. Not its Japanese history. That was brief and strictly educational. Its Russian history. The story of how 2 ships went out against 14. How a commander with shrapnel in his head kept standing on the bridge. How the flag was never struck. Japanese instructors told this story to Japanese cadets. They talked about the Russian sailors, as an example, as a standard of what a military sailor should be. The enemy became the textbook. And that's not all. In 1907, 3 years after the Battle of Chemulpo, Japanese Emperor Mutsuhito did something entirely unprecedented. He sent Vsevolod Rudnev, the man who fired upon Japanese ships and whom the Japanese Navy officially defeated, a personal order. The Order of the Rising Sun, 2nd class. This was one of the highest awards of the Japanese Empire. It was awarded for outstanding service to Japan. Foreigners received it rarely. Commanders of enemy ships never received it. Except for this one time. Rudnev accepted the order, but he never wore it publicly. He deemed it inappropriate for a Russian officer to wear a foreign award for a battle in which his men died. The order was kept at home. The Japanese knew of this decision and treated it with understanding. They would have done exactly the same. Now imagine a Japanese cadet, 18 years old, his first time aboard a warship. The instructor shows him the inscription on the stern. Varyag tells the story. The cadet looks at this inscription and understands. Beneath him is a ship that refused to surrender. That went forward when all calculations said stop. That chose the bottom, but not captivity. And the Japanese Navy considered this lesson important enough to teach it for 9 years. For 9 years, the Soya sailed with Japanese cadets and a Russian name on the stern. 9 years. And then the world changed again. Another war began, a massive European one, later called the First World War. And in this war, Russia and Japan found themselves, incredibly but factually, on the same side. Allies. Yesterday's enemies sitting at the same table. Diplomats remembered the old cruiser anchored in a Japanese port. Negotiations began. And in 1916, Russia bought the Varyag back. April 1916. The Japanese port of Maizuru. 2 officers stand on the pier, a Japanese and a Russian. Between them are papers, transfer documents, inspection reports, financial calculations, diplomatic correspondence stretching over several months, all now stacked neatly, waiting for signatures. The deal amounted to about 4 million gold rubles. The Japanese officer signed first, handed over the pen. The Russian officer signed, looked up, looked at the ship at the pier, On the stern, it was still stamped, Varyag. The Japanese had not painted over the inscription before the handover. Why bother? It was already Russian. Only now it was back where it belonged. The St. Andrew's flag was raised the same day. The crew for the voyage was assembled quickly. The war was raging. Men were needed everywhere at once. Some of the officers were experienced. Some of the sailors were seeing the sea for the first time. This was a common picture for 1916, when the Russian Empire had already been grinding its people in the millstones of the First World War for 3 years. But the ship was alive, and she was going home. On April 5, 1916, the Varyag left Mysuru. The route was not simple. There was no direct path. The Suez Canal was overloaded with Allied military transports. German submarines were already hunting in the Atlantic. Every passage required planning, every port, diplomatic clearances. First, Vladivostok. The ship entered her native Russian port for the first time in 12 years. 12 years ago, she had left here brand new, just accepted into the fleet. Now she was returning, battered, raised from the bottom, rebuilt by Japanese engineers, with alien boilers in the engine room, but returning. In Vladivostok, the ship was inspected. Engineers walked through the compartments, tapped with hammers, wrote in notebooks. The conclusion was cautious. The ship is in satisfactory condition, requires major repairs, and is not ready for combat operations in its current state. This surprised no one. The Varyag spent several weeks in Vladivostok, then back to sea. Ahead lay a voyage that deserves special mention, because it wasn't just a route from point A to point B. It was a passage across multiple oceans in the midst of a world war, on a ship that was already 18 years old, with a hastily assembled crew, with boilers that the Japanese had replaced, but which had not yet been tested on a long voyage. The Pacific Ocean, then the Indian Ocean. The ship sailed carefully without rushing. Mechanics worked in shifts by the boilers. The new boilers ran smoother than the old Niklaus ones, but they still didn't quite trust them completely. There were minor breakdowns along the way. Storms. Once, an alarm was raised over an unidentified silhouette on the horizon, which turned out to be a neutral merchant. In the evenings, officers gathered in the wardroom. Sometimes someone pulled out cards, playing cards, not naval charts. Sometimes they read. Sometimes they just sat in silence, listening to the creaking of the hull and the hum of the engines. One of the midshipmen, young, fresh out of the academy, once asked the chief engineer, "Is it true that this ship was on the bottom?" The engineer looked at him, then at the bulkhead, then back. "It's true. And the Japanese raised her?" "They did. And we bought her back?" "We did." The midshipman fell silent, then said quietly, "Wow, she's a survivor." The engineer chuckled, said nothing. But later, just before sleeping, he lay there a long time staring at the deckhead, thinking the exact same thing. A survivor. That was the right word. The Cape of Good Hope, the Atlantic. It was more dangerous here. German submarines were already sinking Allied ships regularly, methodically, without warning. The cruiser sailed blacked out, with no lights, changing course every few hours. Nothing happened. Luck. Or perhaps it helped that the Varyag always knew how to survive where she shouldn't have. The North Sea, British waters, and finally, autumn 1916. The Varyag arrived in Murmansk, which in Tsarist times was called Romanov on Murman, a very young city, founded just a year prior in 1915, specifically as an ice-free port to supply Russia via the northern route. The ship was met, not as grandly as war heroes. Celebrations were out of fashion in 1916. The war had exhausted everyone. But she was met. The staff officers of the Arctic Ocean Flotilla shook hands. They looked the ship over appraisingly. The Varyag was attached to the flotilla and docked for repairs. The very repairs that had been needed back in Vladivostok. The northern repairs dragged on. Materials were lacking. Specialists were lacking. The war devoured everything. The winter of 1916 to 1917 in Murmansk was brutal. The polar night, the bitter cold, The ship stood at the pier, surrounded by ice, and waited. Russia at this time was rapidly approaching the edge. 3 years of war, millions dead, empty shelves in the cities, bread lines, officers who wrote home and received no answer because there was no one left to write to, or no point. Sailors who listened to agitators on the docks, not because they believed every word, but because they were tired and wanted to go home. February 1917 struck like a shell, suddenly and from all sides at once. Petrograd revolted. The Tsar abdicated. A 300-year-old empire crumbled in a few days, as if it had only been waiting for the moment. On the Varyag, they learned of this from telegraph dispatches. The officers read the messages in silence, passing the papers to each other. The sailors gathered in groups on the deck and talked, loudly, interrupting each other, for the first time without looking over their shoulders at the officers. The provisional government confirmed. The war continues. The fleet remains in service. And in February 1917, the Varyag received orders to sail to England for repairs. Domestic shipyards couldn't cope. British allies could help. It seemed like a sensible decision. No one knew that this decision would be the last in the ship's Russian life. No one could have known, because October lay ahead, and October 1917 changed everything. Britain in 1917 was a tired country. 3 years of trench warfare, hundreds of thousands dead on the Somme, at Ypres, at Gallipoli. The Navy took losses from German submarines every week. The economy was running on fumes. People in London were rationing coal and counting bread coupons. Allies were needed. Russia was an ally. Was. The Varyag arrived in a British port in early 1917 and entered a dry dock for repairs. There was a lot of work to do. The hull, mechanisms, artillery equipment. British engineers inspected the cruiser and drew up an estimate. The estimate was approved. Work began. Everything went according to plan, until October hit. On October 25, 1917, old style, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. For Britain, this was a disaster, and not because London felt any sympathy for the Tsarist regime. Not at all. The British had long been tired of the sluggishness and incompetence of the Nikolaev military machine. But the Bolsheviks did something entirely unacceptable from the perspective of a military ally. They began peace negotiations with Germany. It was betrayal. Not in a moral sense. London understood perfectly well that Russia was exhausted and that the revolution hadn't materialized out of thin air. Betrayal in a strategic sense. If Russia pulls out of the war, the Germans transfer 1 million soldiers from the east to the west. This meant new attacks, new losses, possibly catastrophe on the French front. London was furious. Diplomatic relations with the new Soviet government hung in the balance. Britain was in no hurry to recognize the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were in no hurry to pacify the British. While diplomats exchanged cautious notes, military and financial departments handled matters more simply. Russian property in Britain was subject to seizure. In early 1918, British officials arrived at the shipyard where the Varyag was docked. The procedure was quick and dry, as it always is when a bureaucracy handles matters it cares nothing about. Papers, stamps, signatures. The ship was impounded against the debts the Russian government owed the British crown. The debts were real. Over the years of war, Russia had taken massive loans from the Allies for weapons, equipment, food. The Soviet government refused to recognize these debts. Lenin declared, "Tsarist debts do not concern us. We didn't borrow them. We do not recognize them." London replied in its own way, silently. It simply took what was at hand. By this time, the Varyag's crew had been partially repatriated. A fraction of the sailors still remained on board. Technical staff, a few officers, guards. They learned of the seizure not from an official notice. They saw British military personnel appear on the pier, saw a sentry posted at the gangway, saw the port commander read a paper and shrug. One of the remaining officers, his name has not survived in the documents, wrote a private letter to Petrograd. Short, almost telegraphic. The Varyag is impounded. Crew discharged. What to do? We don't know. Awaiting instructions. No instructions followed. Petrograd was busy with other things. The ship sat in the dock. A month. Half a year. A year. British engineers halted the work. Why repair impounded property at their own expense? The ship slowly began to fall into disrepair. That special silence that descends upon ships when people stop living on them, when there are no voices, no footsteps, no smell of food cooking from the galley, only the creaking of metal and the splashing of water against the hull. Rust is a patient enemy. It does not hurry. It simply waits until people stop looking after things. The Soviet government raised the issue of the Varyag several times through diplomatic channels. The ship was the property of Russia, now Soviet Russia. Return it. The British replied evasively. The debt issue is unresolved. The status of the property is undetermined. Consultations are ongoing. The consultations dragged on for 2 years. In 1920, the British government made a decision, a quiet, administrative one, with no public announcements. The Varyag was put up for sale. Buyers were found quickly. A German company, one of those specializing in shipbreaking, made an offer. The price was accepted. Again, papers. Again, stamps. Again, signatures. The ship that had not surrendered to the Japanese squadron, that was raised from the bottom and lived for 9 years under a foreign flag, that crossed 3 oceans and returned home. This ship was sold for scrap by bureaucrats who had only ever seen it in documents. We need to pause and process this. The Japanese, the enemies, raised the Varyag from the bottom and kept her for 9 years. The Japanese emperor awarded her commander an order. Japanese sailors learned from her history. The British, the Allies, impounded her in a peaceful dock and sold her for scrap. This is not propaganda. These are simply facts standing side by side. The tugboat came for the Varyag in 1920. In the autumn, when the waters of the Irish Sea are already restless, when the wind blows from the north, bringing the cold of the open ocean, the ship was towed out of the dock. The tow line was attached. They pulled. The Varyag went to the breakers silently. There was no crew, no orchestra, no officers on the bridge, just an empty deck, rusty superstructures, and the inscription on the stern, Varyag, which no one had ever bothered to paint over. There was no one on the pier to see her off. No one took off their cap. The tugboat pulled the cruiser west, toward the Scottish shores, toward the ship-breaking yards, toward the boilers and cutting torches that were supposed to turn 6,000 tons of legendary metal into anonymous raw material. But the Varyag always knew how to survive where she shouldn't have. And this time, too, she found a way out. Not a human one, not a military one, something else. Nature did what neither Japanese shells, nor scuttling valves, nor British bureaucrats could do. Somewhere in the Irish Sea, the sky darkened. The barometer plunged, and from the northwest, a storm rolled in. The Irish Sea in autumn is not the sea you see painted on postcards. It is a gray, heavy, angry sea. The waves here aren't beautiful. They are blunt and stubborn, like sledgehammer blows. The wind comes from the northwest, without warning and without mercy. Sailors who had navigated these waters for centuries knew. The Irish Sea does not forgive arrogance. The tugboat pushed west. Behind it, on a long tow line, the Varyag. The line was taut. The ship followed obediently, dead weight, without a rudder, without engines, without will. Just metal on the water. Just cargo being hauled to the scrapyard. The sky darkened fast. First, low clouds from the west. Then, the color of the water changed. It became not gray, but almost black. Then came the wind. First, just strong. Then very strong. Then the waves began to grow. The tug's crew knew their job. They tried to hold the course. Tried to hold the tow line. A tow line is not a rope. It's a steel cable the thickness of a man's wrist. It snaps only when the forces are entirely unequal. The storm was stronger. At some point, The exact time is not recorded in any documents. A storm is no time for taking notes. The tow line snapped. The Varyag was alone. No tugboat, no crew, no engines. 6,000 tons of steel in the open sea, in a storm, completely out of control. The waves took her as they pleased, spinning her, listing her, shoving her. She drifted wherever the wind pushed her. The wind pushed her toward the coast. The Scottish coast, where the Varyag was drifting, is not a beach. It's rocks and shallows, stones and kelp, gray cliffs that have stood there since the dawn of time, waiting for ships. They have waited out many. The Firth of Clyde, the west coast of Scotland. This was where those very Normans, the Varangians who gave the ship her name, once landed. Scandinavian longships sailed these waters 1,000 years ago. The Vikings knew this coast. They dragged their ships onto these stones, lit fires, and stared out at the exact same gray water. The Varyag was heading for this shore, not knowing this. Or knowing it. Who can say what a ship knows and what it doesn't? She ran aground. No explosion, no catastrophe. Just the crunch against the seabed, the grinding of metal on stone, and the ship stopped. Forever. The storm raged for a few more hours. Waves kept battering the hull, but the Varyag no longer moved. She had found the bottom, and this time, it was hers. When the storm died down and it became possible to approach the wreck site, it became clear. Pulling the ship off the rocks was impossible. She was sitting too deep. The hull had been severely damaged during the grounding. It was too shallow for divers to work comfortably, and heavy machinery couldn't get through. The German company that had bought the Varyag for scrap ran the numbers. Salvaging her would cost more than the metal was worth. The Varyag was written off. And so she remained, stranded off the west coast of Scotland, in the Firth of Clyde. Gradually, local residents began dismantling her, some for the metal, some out of curiosity. The Scots are a practical people. Parts of the ship made their way into nearby villages. They say that in some houses today, you can still find pieces of metal of unknown origin. Heavy, rusty, with traces of paint, that owners use as gateweights or garden ornaments, completely unaware of where that metal came from. The sea went about its work slowly and methodically. Saltwater, tides, seaweed, and mollusks. Year after year, the hull sank deeper, disintegrated, became part of the seabed. Today, you can dive at the site of the Varyag's wreck. Divers do it, though not many. It's not a popular dive spot. Visibility is poor. The water is cold, even in summer. But if you dive and know where to look, you can see it. Metal. Rusty, overgrown, almost indistinguishable from the rock. But metal. Somewhere down there, underwater, in a cold Scottish firth, lie the remains of the ship that went out against 14, that never lowered her flag, that lay on the bottom in Korea, was raised by the Japanese, sailed under 3 flags, crossed 3 oceans, and in the end, chose the northern waters. Like a true Varangian. This isn't a metaphor, it's simply what is. The Normans, the very people whose name the ship bore, came to these waters in their longships. They knew this shore. And 1,000 years later, the ship named in their honor found her final resting place here. History loves such coincidences. Or non-coincidences. Stop for a second and think about the journey of this ship. Born in America, served in Russia, fought in Korea, lay on the bottom, raised by the Japanese, 9 years under the Japanese flag, bought back by Russia, crossed 3 oceans, impounded by the British, sold for scrap. And at the end, a storm, a snapped tow line, a Scottish shore. No novelist would write such a biography. They'd think it was too much, that the reader wouldn't believe it. But it happened. And in this journey, there is one thread that never breaks anywhere. From Philadelphia to Scotland, from 1899 to 1920, through all the flags, all the wars, all the decisions of the men who commanded her or disposed of her fate, the flag was never lowered. Not once. Japanese didn't lower it. They raised the ship and left the Russian name on the stern. The British didn't lower it. They just sold the ship without looking into the details. The storm didn't lower it. It just stopped the ship where it stopped her. The Varyag ended her journey herself, on her own terms, as always. And what was left of her was not left on the bottom. It was left somewhere else. In 1904, while the crew of the Varyag was still making its way home on neutral ships, a song was already being published in Germany. The German poet Rudolf Greins wrote it a few weeks after the battle. He had read the newspaper reports. He was not on the Varyag. He didn't know Rudnev personally. He simply read about it and wrote. The song was called Varyag, in German. Later, it was translated into Russian, then set to music, then sung at crew reunions, then on the fronts of the First World War, then everywhere there were Russian sailors. A German wrote a song about a Russian ship before the Russians managed to do it themselves. That says something. What exactly it says, we will discuss a little later. First, something else. Immediately after the crews returned to Russia, what always happens after major events began, a debriefing. Not public, quiet, internal, in the offices of the Naval Ministry. The right questions were asked. Why was the Varyag alone in Chemulpo? Why weren't the boilers replaced during 3 years of service? Why did intelligence fail to provide accurate information about the intentions of the Japanese fleet? Finally, why was a breakthrough deemed impossible? Perhaps with a different decision, a different course, different tactics, there still would have been a chance. These are important questions, honest questions, and historians still ask them today. Some go further. They say Rudnev exaggerated Japanese losses, that no real damage was done to the Japanese squadron, that the battle was lost not only in terms of numbers, but tactically. All of this may be true. But here is what's strange. The more historians argue about the details of the Battle of Chemulpo, the clearer it becomes that they are arguing about the wrong thing. They argue about the result. But the feat was not in the result. Imagine a man who knows he is going to lose, knows it for certain, mathematically, without any illusions. And he goes out anyway. Not because he is stupid, not because he is a fanatic, but because there are things more important than victory. Rudnev was a smart man. He knew how to calculate. He understood everything, and he went out. This is exactly what the German poet wrote about, what the commanders of the foreign ships in Chemulpo understood as they took off their caps, what Japanese Admiral Uryu understood when he wrote in his report, "Fought with honor," what the Japanese emperor understood when he sent the medal. This is not a Russian story. It is a human story, about how the choice matters more than the outcome. In the Soviet Union, the Varyag became an official symbol. Films, books, stamps, monuments. The image of the heroic cruiser was polished to a mirror shine and embedded in state mythology. Some details were omitted. For example, the ship's Japanese period was barely mentioned in Soviet textbooks. It was awkward to explain that enemies preserved a Russian ship with more respect than allies did. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the pendulum swung the other way. Exposé articles appeared. Authors eagerly wrote about inflated reports, minimal damage to the Japanese, and claimed there was no heroic feat at all, just a military failure that propaganda had inflated into a legend. These articles weren't entirely honest either, because exposing a legend is just as easy as creating one. Both are ways of not thinking. Thinking means holding two facts in your head simultaneously. First, the Battle of Chemulpo was lost. There was almost no real military result. The Japanese squadron was unharmed. The Varyag lay on the bottom. Second, the commander knew all of this in advance, and he went out, and he didn't lower his flag. Both facts are true. Both are important. And only together do they form the real picture. A defeat accepted with dignity sometimes means more than a victory won by chance. This is understood not only in Russia. In 1954, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, a memorial plaque was installed in the Japanese city of Sasebo. by the Japanese, on their own, without requests, without diplomatic negotiations. They just put up a plaque with text about the Russian sailors who had fought in those waters 50 years earlier. The enemies remembered better than some of their own. Today, you can dive at the wreck site of the Varyag off the Scottish coast. Divers go there, though not many. It's not a tourist hotspot. Cold water, poor visibility, rusted metal on the bottom. Nothing picturesque. But those who have dived say the exact same thing. There is something about that metal. Something that makes you stop underwater and just look. Not take pictures, not touch. Just look. Maybe it's just rust and kelp, or maybe something else. In 1995, the guided missile cruiser Varyag joined the Russian Pacific Fleet. Project 1164, Atlant. Length, 186 meters. 16 cruise missiles. Anti-aircraft systems. A helicopter pad. One of the most powerful surface ships in the Russian Navy. The flagship of the Pacific Fleet. She is based in Vladivostok, the exact place where the old Varyag stopped for a few weeks in 1916, on her way home from Japan. She sails the same waters, the Sea of Japan, the Pacific Ocean, sometimes further. 2 Varyags, separated by 120 years. One is on the bottom off the coast of Scotland. 6,000 tons of rusted metal in a cold firth, a few meters underwater, without a crew, without a flag, without the name on the stern. It's been gone a long time, eaten by the water. The other is right now, this very minute, somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, with a crew, with a flag, with the name on her hull. The name did not sink. And this is what is important to understand at the very end. Legends are not born from victories. There have been many victories, for all fleets, all armies, all empires. Most victories are forgotten. Legends are born from choices. Rudnev could have stayed, could have surrendered. He chose a third option. The Varyag could have become a pile of scrap at a German shipyard. The Storm chose differently. The Japanese could have stripped the Russian name from the stern. They left it. Every time history reached a crossroads, something chose the path that is never forgotten. Maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe not.